I want to move the discussion onto a more global arena and also looking at some of the global aspects to Brexit and hoping that these issues will be priorities for the European Council. Some of these we have been discussing recently at the Foreign Affairs Committee. The first one is on the implications in relation to Brexit on the UK's contribution to humanitarian aid and the fear that this is an aspect that's not getting very much attention. The UK was a major contributor to the EU's development fund, and at times it was a respected voice when it came to developing policy. Now, on the budgets, first of all, there is a major loss to the budget, and we did have figures that were discussed at the recent committee. And the question, of course, is will the shortfall be taken up by other EU members? Now, the EU funding is through the EU budget and the European Development Fund, and certainly Britain, with the EU budget last year, I think 13.4%, which came to 1.23 billion out of a total of 9 billion. And on the Development Fund, their share was 4.48 billion out of a total of 30 billion. And they are sizable contributions. And there are serious questions around what is going to happen if they're no longer going to be available to the poorest countries in the world. There are also questions around the absence of Britain at the EU table on development policy, because they were a voice in the argument that development cooperation should focus strongly on the root causes of migration, which we know are poverty, abuse of human rights, land grabs and climate change. And no one can deny the importance of that, because no one should have to leave their country of origin because they're hungry, or they can't find work, or they've had their land taken, or they were subjected to human rights abuses because of their gender or religion or ethnicity or sexual orientation. But there are major questions around the EU Development Fund and the Trust Fund, where it is going to countries who are instrumental in human rights abuses. And so instead of tackling the root causes of migration, it appears to be to leave people in abject circumstances so they don't intrude on our comfortable existences. And I think we need greater transparency and greater accountability on exactly where the EU Development Trust Fund is going. Now, what we've seen recently is the regularisation of thousands of sub-Saharan African migrants to Morocco, where I understand they are very welcome, but it can't be at the expense of the Sahrawi people. And the EU Court of Justice ruling recently on an agricultural deal, it did treat the disputed territory of Western Sahara as independent from Morocco, and suddenly there was a bigger influx of these migrants into Europe. On the UK policy, where they won't be missed, is the fact that under the last two Tory governments, UK aid has been leading towards more privatisation of aid, and at least Ireland is holding on to its reputation in untied aid. With the British government gone from policy formalisation, then we might have a greater emphasis on more untied aid, that aid is for the betterment of the receiver and not primarily for the economic benefit of the donor. And we saw British aid increasingly more and more being seen as tied to private finance. We have Irish NGOs and various organisations. They have been much stronger in relation to trade deals like the EPAs, but there are certainly major questions over Britain and trade deals and the issue of human rights and worker rights. There are voices in Britain who are highlighting this, concerns about a British Empire Part 2 appearing and wanting to do deals with human rights abusing dictators. I'm just going to quote from a recent article in the Guardian about Britain: a ruling elite tortured by its inability to rule the world, which believes such a role is its birthright and can still make more dangerous decisions. And if they're not at the EU, I think there's far more scope for them to do that. Now, we're looking increasingly at the potential positives for Ireland from Brexit, and that's the possibility of international financial sector firms moving to Ireland. We got a figure recently that if 1% of companies moved here, that would mean an extra 6,000 jobs. Now, it's good to see a growing consensus across Europe for further transparency on tax issues, and that means public country-by-country reporting, which we seem to be resisting here. We appear to be supportive of country-by-country, but not publicly. So there is a need for enhanced regulation and oversight of our tax policies, because our reputation is already tarnished by the term tax haven being applied here. Those financial and taxation practices have an impact on the developing countries. So the question is, are we committed to tax justice? And is the EU committed to tax justice? And will that be a feature at Council meetings going forward? The EU is the biggest contributor to ODA, but UN figures tell us that developing countries lose more through tax dodging than they gain in aid, some $100 billion annually. So the question is around policy coherence. When we look at refugees, Oxfam tell us that the wealthiest countries in the world host just 9% of the global refugee population. And there are countries in the EU with very regressive policies on refugees. And the mantra seems to be good migration management. And that means the EU Trust Fund is being used for security and border management by states with appalling human rights records. And this is at a time when certain African countries are facing horrific famine in 2017. One country already in famine, 3 others on the brink. And where is the awareness and the coping with these matters at European Council level? I'm talking about northern Nigeria, South Sudan, Yemen and Somalia. And the UN has designated Yemen as the worst humanitarian crisis on the globe, with 70% of the population dependent on humanitarian assistance. The conflict there is fuelled by official arms sales by some EU countries and also by Western countries, primarily the UK and the US. And will that come up at the European Council meeting this week, at both that level and also at the UN level? And will Ireland be an influential voice to stop countries selling arms, which is fuelling the conflict? And will we condemn the UK's selling of arms to Saudi Arabia and other EU countries as well? And where are the EU and the Irish ambassadors to Saudi Arabia? Where are their voices? And what's our embassy in Saudi Arabia? Is it making known concerns on this? There will be a Yemen donor conference in Geneva later in April. I think it's important for our Minister for Foreign Affairs to attend. And if he does, will he be a strong voice on these matters? As of the 15th of March 2017, humanitarian response plan is only 7% funded. Now, Ireland has been very strong in its commitment to humanitarian disasters. But while we are talking about narrow interests here, there are people in certain countries in the world who are starving at this moment. There are hundreds of thousands of malnourished children. And where's the European Council on that? They're giving the funding. Is it going to the right places? Finally, then, I just wanted to return to Palestine. The EU is demanding that Israel puts an end to demolishing the Palestinian homes in Area C of the West Bank. This is particularly the Bedouin village of Khan al-Ahmar. There's going to be a forced transfer of residents, which is violating the Geneva Convention Article 49, which says that individual or mass forcible transfers, as well as deportation of protected persons from occupied territories of the occupying power or any other country, occupied or not, that is prohibited. But yet the European Council is not a voice there. They say the words, but they're not taking it up further. So what can the European Council do to protect these Bedouin people and to uphold and respect the Geneva Convention? Palestinian human rights organisations confirm in the past year alone 97 Palestinian people were killed in the West Bank and Gaza, including 36 children. There's an impending hunger strike of Palestinian prisoners. And I do want to acknowledge those Israeli groups and individuals who do not subscribe to what has been going on in their country. But the fact is, Europe is sustaining illegal settlements. And one final question. We have a number of ambassadors to Britain, because they don't have embassies here, but they come here to present credentials, and that's an important link with those countries. So is there any plans to deal with that particular issue in the light of Brexit? Thank you.